So we can call you Vivian, I guess. Is that
Sure.
a good name to use? Okay. And State of the Nile is Lee, apparently.
Is that your
Yes,
real
It's his secret name,
maybe.
his pseudonym.
name? What
Um,
name are you going to use?
I think I'll just be BG, unless you guys have a better name.
No, that works.
I'm open to suggestions. We don't really need names that much, but I mean, we could be, I don't know. I feel like it should be something like Lenin or Stalin, something. Like, I like the pseudonyms that those early communist revolutionaries had. They were kind of manly, serious sounding.
Those are pseudonyms.
Oh, yes, Lenin and Stalin, yeah.
Yeah, they're not.
What was his real
Oh,
name?
Lenin was it Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, I think, something like that. Stalin was an impronounceable Georgian name, like Jugashvili. I don't even know.
I mean, even like Plato, that wasn't his real name either.
Oh yeah, that was a nickname. Yeah,
It means like broad shoulders or something like that.
yeah. But did they even have the concept of official names back then, or did they just go by like?
I mean, he did have a real name. I can't remember it. It starts with an A.
Oh, okay. All right. So now on to the main event, social constructs. I was thinking a bit about how to frame this, and I was thinking of just going through the uses of ideas and giving my notion of a social construct. And then maybe from there we can go into how that concept is used in political and cultural discourse. So we have a lot of different uses for ideas. I think this is one of the most interesting things about human beings, that because we have language, we can communicate ideas. And so we not only use ideas to represent reality and to represent our values that relate to reality, things like, this is good for me or that's bad for me. We also use ideas to communicate, and then we have other social uses for ideas that go beyond just communicating judgments of truth and value. For example, we have some ideas that are socially constructed to organize our behavior. Rights and obligations. Those are constructed in the sense that we explicitly create them, right? We explicitly create an idea like a law or money or a promise. And then once that idea is created, it has implications that impose obligations and confer rights. So people have rights and obligations that depend on these ideas that we construct. Money is one of the most interesting examples. We create money with banking operations, then we transfer it around from one person to another. And the money that you have is your right to consume goods and services, right? And money is an imaginary substance. It has no physical reality. We just create it. And when you have it, you don't have a physical substance in your possession. You just have the idea of money in the bank, right? Or in whatever. It may be in your wallet as a piece of paper, but even then the piece of paper can be destroyed and the money can still exist. So that's my notion of a social construct. It is something like a law or money that we explicitly, formally create socially by agreeing that it exists. So what do you guys think about that? Are you familiar with that idea of social constructs like money, laws, promises, etc.?
The biggest thing that people like to say is a social construct and therefore it's irrelevant is gender. So do you think that's something we create, or is that organic?
I would say let's leave that for now, because what I was thinking is, let's start from the most constructed thing, which is money or laws, the things that are explicitly socially constructed. Then let's move to things like gender, where there is an element of that, In this, like when you get a birth certificate, somebody writes on it male or female. There is a legal representation. You have a legal gender. But of course, the reality of it is still there, right? It's not like you construct the reality of it. But let's just leave gender for a minute. So I was going to say that there is that notion of a social construct, which is this thing that we very explicitly create that has no physical reality at all. There is also a layer underneath that which is cultural, like the idea of money, or, well, all of the ideas that we use to communicate. That's all part of culture, which is emergent, which is not explicitly constructed, but is social in the sense that it emerges out of communication.
I think a lot of it does start with, say, an idea, something like an abstract idea, and then that is then reified through behavior, social behavior. So just like an idea of, what we want, and then it kind of is made concrete, like in quotations, through our interactions with one another. So, I mean, that's just how I look at it. And it's kind of that's how it would relate to all the other forms as well.
You mean something like money, or?
Well, this applies, I think, to all social constructions, though you specified that this one is the more explicit version.
So there's the social construct that where we explicitly create something like money or a law or whatever. Then there is the cultural, like the subconscious knowledge that all of that depends on, most of which we're not really aware of ordinarily, and we just take it for granted, right? Like, what is money? Well, I just know what it is. Like, it's a contingent fact for most people that they have a certain amount of money in the bank, but the concept of money is a subconscious, shared concept, right?
Yeah.
And we have other subconscious shared concepts like tree or rain or whatever that are mostly about something that is physical or biological, and so it refers to something else, that not just what we construct, right? So money refers only to itself, but tree refers to some physically real thing or category of things, right?
Yeah.
And the most clear notion of social construction is when we construct things like money or laws or promises or, deals, any kind of agreement. But then what the left have done is they have taken, I shouldn't say the left, but certain postmodern thinkers and, various thinkers have taken that notion of constructing, explicitly constructing things, ideas to use to organize our behavior, and they have kind of transferred it down metaphorically down toward the ideas that we use to represent reality or to communicate ideas about reality. It's kind of a reversal of the normal direction of metaphors. Like, metaphors usually go from the concrete to the more abstract. They have taken this abstract idea and they have tried to push it down to other uses of ideas to discredit those uses or those ideas.
So, like, an example would be, in a science, we rely on constructive models. So they would apply these pure constructions like money to the more scientific approach and try to say that there is no like external referent, or that the external referent doesn't really carry any information, that these models are just like infinitely applicable.
Yeah, they're trying to carry down the arbitrariness down to that level. Okay, so I guess the fundamental point that, well, I shouldn't say the fundamental point. One of the points I want to make is that there is a valid analysis and critique of knowledge that it is to some extent social, right? And that social forces affect belief and concepts. And the notion of social construction is used to dismiss ideas that, and it's usually the left, so I'll just say the left, that the left doesn't like. So if they don't like the idea of biological sex, they will try to dismiss it by saying it's a social construct. Or if they don't like implications of rationality or science, they will say those are just social constructs, right?
Yeah.
And then there's another side which says, well, that's all nonsense, your sex is just your sex, The other side pretends that there's no issue at all. Like there's no concern there at all. There's no philosophical critique. That's all just bullshit, right? It's just bullshit philosophy.
Yeah.
And I think the truth is somewhere, well, not really in between, but it's that there is this valid critique. However, it does not negate knowledge, or it does not imply that our beliefs are arbitrary or our uses of ideas are arbitrary. And it also doesn't imply that right-wing ideas are wrong and left-wing ideas are right. So they use it tactically to dismiss ideas they don't like.
Yeah.
Right. I would say that's the main use of it in political discourse. Okay, I feel like I'm dominating this. I'm not comfortable in this dominant role. Okay. I get called a beta a lot. That's funny. I'm such a beta. I feel like I got to revert back to my beta norm here.
Well, I mean, I guess I could jump in and say that.
Oh, by the way, wait, before you do that, have you guys seen that picture of Trudeau with Sadiq Khan?
Oh, God, yeah.
No.
For some reason, I just thought of that. No homo, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I agree with generally what you're saying. I do think it's important to recognize that our knowledge of the world around us is nowhere near as straightforward. It's like this. I think those on the right, they tend to adhere to a form of, I guess you could call it like naive realism, where it's just like, oh yeah, you just look at it, guys. It's there. Just we can all see it. It's like, no, I mean, it's not that. It's not really that simple, because we think about things in the external world through conceptual models, which are generalized representations. And I definitely think it's very important to point this out, and to point out that as a result of this, our knowledge about the world is nowhere near as certain as you might assume. Nowhere near as certain as a naive realist might imply. But at the same time, of course, the left, they do take it too far. This is, especially the postmodern left. So, man, shoot, I was going to say something.
Well, maybe Vivian can jump in. And
Yeah, you can jump in.
Do you think that it's a valid critique to say that putting things into categories is a social construct, or like taxonomizing things?
In large part, I would say yeah. I mean, I wouldn't dismiss the idea that certain categories, discrete categories, might exist. But I think a lot of it is just convention, just identifying certain properties that are common among complex objects, and then reifying a certain category, the existence of a particular category. So I wouldn't say that they're arbitrary, though.
there are information theoretic reasons for things like racial categories.
That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah. And like if you take the data and you cluster it, you will get clusters that are similar to our intuitive categories and our social categories of race. But there's also a certain amount of contextuality to something like that. Like, if you live in the United States, the three most relevant races are Hispanic, Black, and white. If you live somewhere else, your notions of race are going to be different, right? So it depends on the distribution of the people around you, how your brain will divide the world up into categories. And then also, it will depend to some extent on the way others around you divide the world up into categories.
Yeah. Well, I would say that to some extent, I think this idea that something's like purely socially constructed or natural or, socially constructed or genetic, I think these things are like false dichotomies. It's a false dichotomy. It's usually a little bit of both. They usually it's just a combination, and I guess that's the point. There are certain actual distinctive markers to identify the different races, but they're not like completely discrete. So we do. There is some degree of arbitrariness.
Are you guys familiar with this? And I was actually taught this when I was in college, that sex and gender are actually two different things.
Yeah.
The way I would define it is gender is the perception or the social role, and sex is the biological sex, like, whether you're male or female, XX or XY.
Yeah, and I would say that, originally the sex and the gender distinction was designed to say that, sex was the biological construct, and then gender was the cultural or social construct, or I think I said construct for biological. I don't think that applies though. But the point is that we now know today that this distinction is either just outright fallacious or just very tenuous at best. So we know that culture and social behavior are influenced by genetics. So creating this distinction between like sex as a biological and then gender as cultural and social, that just doesn't work, because cultural and social are in turn influenced in part by genetics. So just these things are now tied. So either they're synonymous, or gender is like a cultural expression of biological sex.
I think you could separate them, but still accept that they're tied.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree in general that it is very hard to disentangle them, because the perception of gender is going to be obviously hugely tied to biology. But I think to some extent the term gender was used as a euphemism for sex, because the word sex means sexual intercourse as well, and so it's kind of like it's an emotionally laden word, so people wanted to get away from that. And then also it was also to some extent a deliberate attempt to minimize the significance of sex differences by implying that they are like gender in language, because there's gender in certain languages, right? There are male and female forms of words, and there's no rationale for dividing up the language into male and female forms. It's just this completely arbitrary distinction. And I think that to some extent they were attempting to weaken the notion of biological sex by calling it gender.
Yeah.
And I think I was also taught in college that like gender exists on a spectrum. Was that Kinsey that said that, maybe? Have you ever heard that before?
I've definitely heard it. I don't know where it originates from. And basically this is them emphasizing things like secondary sex characteristics as opposed to, say, gametes or something. Because, if you want to construct like a predictive model of sex, you need to identify people based on their gametes. And this is like across species as well. So, it's not just humans. But they ignore that, and they emphasize that they emphasize the secondary sex characteristics, like the subtle differences in facial structure, and if you focus in on just that, there is some truth to this idea that it is spectral. But the problem comes from the fact that they're ignoring gametes.
Yeah, I always thought that the spectrum thing was more related to like gender expression, like however masculine you perceive yourself, or however masculine you express yourself, like that exists on a spectrum, and you can be biologically male but express yourself as biologically female. And I'm kind of playing devil's advocate. It's kind of fun right now, but
well, I would say that is somewhat consistent because, I mean, I kind of consider gender and gender expression like I don't really see a meaningful distinction there because, I mean, gender itself, in my view, would be the expression of biological sex. So it's just again, it's a cultural expression, and I guess you could point out that culture does vary in how rigid their gender roles are. So some might be more permanent of like a spectrum of behavior, and others might have these rigid roles.
Well, there are signifiers that people use to indicate their masculinity or femininity. And you could say that masculinity and femininity exist on a spectrum and that they are polar opposites on that spectrum.
Yeah.
And that's like, as Lee was saying, our secondary sexual characteristics are not 100% discrete. You know, like there are effeminate men and masculine women and so on and so forth. Even though the genetic distinction is binary. But then there are also those, I guess, tertiary characteristics, the ones that people express. So if you dress like a man or dress like a woman, that's you're signifying to others, I am a man or I am a woman, right? And most people exaggerate their secondary sexual characteristics to accentuate their masculinity or femininity. Some people don't. So I think that there are multiple layers to this, right? There's the biological, there is even in the biological there are two layers, and then there is the cultural and social layers on top of that. That people have a concept of the two genders or two sexes, and there are sex role stereotypes that exist in the culture, and then even on top of that, you can have the layer of society, like marriage, which is a social construct, right? It's an explicitly constructed relationship. And, the idea, marriage is between a man and a woman, or marriage is between any two people, that's a social issue, right? So there are these different layers at which those distinctions exist. I can't remember how we got off on this tangent, though, but go ahead, jump in.
I mean, I might be taking this off on a new tangent here, but this is where I think I briefly mentioned earlier, where I think social constructions and the distinction from like a genetic or a naturally biological thing, I think that it is a false dichotomy, and I think the idea of marriage might be a good example of this, because marriage isn't something that it's not completely arbitrary. It is a universal in human behavior. So yeah, you need to like provide an explanation for why it's socially constructed in many different contexts, and this applies to like many different constructs.
Well, I guess to answer that, you have to back up and say, what does it mean for something to be socially constructed? Like, what are the different ways that an idea can come into existence and be related to reality?
Well, I mean, ideas, they have to appeal to us psychologically, right? Especially if they're like going to spread and then be reified through social behavior.
Well, yes and no. I mean, they have to appeal to us, but, take something like the amount of money you have in the bank. I mean, that's constructed by social operations, right? Like bank transactions. So that's an example of something that's like really clearly socially constructed, because the amount of money you have in the bank was explicitly constructed by communication acts, right?
Yeah.
So in what sense are, say, sex roles or the gender distinction, the male-female distinction, constructed? Does it make sense to call that a construction? Or is that just an inappropriate metaphor?
Well, yeah, this is precisely the issue, is that I think that a lot of the things, it just, again, you can't really separate things into these categories. I mean, money is a clear example of something that's really socially constructed. I don't know if we could come up with a way in which perhaps genetics influenced that. I doubt it, but or at least very vaguely. But this ties to something that I talked about in my the human nature video I had, where basically I said that genetics provide like a probabilistic framework, which then culture then constructs more specifically. So the fine details of like gender roles and gender expression come from specific environmental influences, perhaps random effects, and yeah, that's ultimately where culture comes from. But if you want to explain the universals in human behavior, then according to the gender roles and stuff, then that's where you appeal to the framework within which our behavior operates.
Well, okay, so I'm not sure that really gets to the point, though, because... Okay, well, let me try something. I'm going to ask you guys a series of questions about whether things are constructed, and tell me what you think. Tell me the extent to which you think these things are constructed, and if so, how are they constructed? So I'll start with Vivian. Is gender constructed?
I think gender expression is constructed.
Okay, so in what way is it constructed?
Well, it is cultural, the way the different genders express themselves. Like, I guess you could say that in every culture, at least every culture that I'm aware of, there are two or more, I guess, categories, or not categories.
Like roles, social roles?
Yeah, like the roles are different from culture to culture. But there's definitely like a spectrum of how different they are in each culture. Like some are like there's a huge distinction, and then there's not so much of a, like in Western culture right now, like people are really into trying to blur the distinction between genders. And you see it a lot. Like, you know, I feel like 100 years ago, men and women would dress very different. It would be really obvious, you know, that these are two separate categories. But now it's like, you know, you could get away with wearing the same thing. Like women wear pants, women wear their hair short.
Yeah, that's true. Although men have taken to growing beards more now, maybe as to compensate for that, the ambiguous styles.
Yeah.
So you think that at least that aspect of it is constructed, but it's constructed subconsciously.
I'm not sure that like the ambiguity was subconscious. I think there was maybe a conscious effort to make the genders more ambiguous because people were trying to be more equal.
Yeah.
Like, does it come, I think it maybe came out of the 1960s. I don't know when people started doing that. I think it became definitely a huge thing in the 70s.
Yeah, that's true. There's a kind of feedback between it. Like there are cultural shifts that no one really plans, but then there are also these conscious attempts to shape culture and push it in one direction or another.
Right.
Okay, so you think gender expression is constructed, but the difference between men and women is mostly not constructed?
The biological differences are not constructed, but the way gender is expressed changes from what I can see. So that is kind of socially constructed because I think it depends on the time and place that you're in. It's not going to be the same in each time and place.
Okay. Lee, what do you think?
Okay, my answer I think is going to pull from that book I was reading, the social construction book.
Okay.
So I he made the distinction between the social construction of ideas, usually categories or ways of grouping people, and then the construction of objects. Or by objects, he just means specific things that actually exist. So like the people themselves. Mm-hmm. So going off of that, I would say that gender is constructed in the sense that there exists an idea of say what a man is, and there exists an idea of what a woman is, and these ideas are reified into existence through a socialization, and that creates a category. And then he talks about the interaction between socially constructed ideas and the objects. So once this category has been created, well, then people are socialized to fit them. So then the people themselves are now being constructed and put into these roles.
Yeah, the loopiness of it is important, right? That the idea can affect the reality, and that's something that leftists talk about a lot. Things like stereotypes, unconscious bias creating the behavior. Basically, the stereotype makes itself real. Yes,
and well, I think the important thing to note, though, is I don't think that people on the left come up with an adequate explanation for why the ideas exist themselves. Like I started this thing by talking about, the idea of the man, the idea of the woman. But where do those come from? And again, I think that they spread and are generated by fitting in with our psychology, which in turn is a phenotype. So depending on, I think it's a combination of just environmental factors and genetic factors that might contribute to why certain ideas about what a man is or what a woman is are accepted.
Yeah. Well, I think the whole transgender thing demonstrates the absurdity of the extreme position, because I've brought this up before, but the term gender reassignment surgery is such a strange Orwellian thing, right? Like you're assigned your gender by society at birth, but then you have to have your genitals mutilated, to reassign it. It just doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this might be unrelated, but I've always wondered if, like, in the future, we're going to look back on gender reassignment surgery and, like, in the same way that we look back on, like, lobotomy or something, like, in horror.
I'm sure we will.
Like, what the fuck were we doing?
Do look at it like that already. I kind of do.
It's horrible. Yeah, it's a horrible thing.
In the future, we're going to come up with some, like, psychological thing to help, make them fit the body rather than changing the body to fit the mind, We're just going to look back and like, holy shit.
A better analogy I see for it is, what is it called when they, chop off your, can you remind me? The word is on the tip of my tongue. When they chop off your private parts, like.
Castrate?
Yeah, castration.
Oh, well, that's only the testicles, but yeah.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Transgenderism goes beyond castration. It's like a full replumbing of your body.
Yeah, they like create a fake vagina and everything.
It's kind of like similar though. Like, didn't they used to castrate male singers so they would not go through puberty? Or I guess like this is more like the kids who take puberty blockers, which I don't know how many people actually do that. Is that like overblown? Like that people are actually doing that? It's just very hard for me to imagine that's.
I mean, some people are doing it, and it's partly because teenagers are confused anyway, and this is a way to get attention. So it's like it didn't exist 20 years ago. There were hardly any transsexuals 20 years ago. It was just a freak subculture. But now I think every high school has at least one or two transsexuals. So yeah, I think people are doing it. I think people are mutilating their bodies.
That's just amazing to me that they would do it with children.
No, it's horrific. It's
child abuse. Yeah.
Not only is it horrific, but it just doesn't even make sense. Because if your gender is just assigned, you just reassign it. You shouldn't have to get surgery. Like it's where it comes full circle. But okay, so that's gender. I guess I should answer it too. I think gender is not, or it's minimally constructed. I think it is socially influenced, how we express our gender or our sexuality, but it is mostly biologically determined. So I guess part of this is also how much freedom do we have to change things, right? How much of this is biologically determined and we can't change it? How much of this is not really arbitrary? Just because something's socially determined doesn't mean it's arbitrary. But how much of this is up to us to choose? And I think with sexuality and sex roles, not very much, but a few things like, styles and, there are some things that we're free to choose. I think very little of it is explicitly constructed in the way that money is constructed. I think the only thing that is explicitly constructed there are things like marriage and birth certificate, gender, and the modern concept of reassigning your gender. Those things are social constructs.
Hey,
Yeah, and
my son is crying.
Oh, okay.
Can I just run up and...
Yeah, sure, of course. All right, Lee, I've got a question for you. Is morality socially constructed?
well, I would say that it's socially constructed in a similar way to that gender is. So I am sympathetic to Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. So basically, he argues that, again, there's a genetic framework or a set of foundations upon which culture then embellishes, I guess.
Does he actually think that those foundations are genetic?
He justifies them with evolutionary explanations. Basically, he went and took a bunch of research in evolutionary psychology and basically came up with these foundations based on some stuff that was like consistent across cultures, and then to provide like a basis for everything, and then he specifies that culture then embellishes, I guess.
I would have to take a look at that. But okay, so you think, what do you think? You think it's biologically determined, and then on top of that there's culture. What about explicit social construction of morality?
Explicit social construction?
Consciously choosing our morality.
Well, I question just how much of this will we have, because actually something I was going to mention before you brought this up was that I don't think that, like, even if something is not genetic, if it's like a cultural thing, I still don't think we have all that much control, because like the natural environment, the geography, those shape our behavior in a lot of ways too, and the material conditions, all of these things. So we don't have control in that sense either. And so I always question just how much control we have. Like, can we really choose what we find to be right or wrong? I just, like, I can't imagine myself changing what I value, and I don't think most people can.
But haven't you done that yourself, going from being a religious person to being an atheist and being an amoralist and all that?
Well, the thing is, like, when I was a Christian, that I was...
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I was always really, like, frustrated with trying to justify everything I was being told, you know? And I remember I would get into arguments with some people, and it's like, I don't give a fuck what the Bible says. I believe this.
Okay.
So it's just like, it never worked.
Okay.
I've definitely changed my values as I've gotten older, and just in general, quite a bit, actually.
Okay, well, hold that thought, but do you think morality is socially constructed? That's the question I asked Lee.
Yes.
Okay. In what sense?
Well, different people have different morals. It's definitely either personal or cultural. There's a huge spectrum of what morals can be, and yeah, I mean, that's
okay.
An interesting question.
So I'll answer it, and then we'll go back to what you were saying. I liked this concept of explicit construction. It fits the word construction better. And then determined might be a better word for, things that are cultural and not really consciously chosen. I think morality is, it obviously has a biological basis in the sense that we have certain instincts. But on top of those, culture plays a huge role, and your social environment plays a huge role in that you are both implicitly and explicitly trained to be good. I mean, even with kids, you're always telling them that's bad, that's good. I mean, this concept of approval and disapproval is there from the very beginning. And so that's part of it. But then there are also these explicit attempts to change morality on a large scale, like the whole gay marriage, gay acceptance, or anti-racism. In fact, every culture war is essentially a war over not only moral narratives, but in a way over moralities, like to some extent over moral values, I think. So there is an aspect of that that is socially constructed, or at least socially determined. So I guess I'm kind of in the middle there too.
Yeah.
Do you think? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say that I think maybe a good way to look at it is to make the distinction between, say, a social construction and then like an emergent phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So the emergent is what you referred to as determined earlier.
Yeah, it's emergent in the sense that it arises, but no one designed it, like language. Nobody designed the English language. It just emerged out of people communicating.
Yeah.
Right? And I think a lot of, like, there's this huge substructure of ideas and patterns, concepts, patterns, whatever, that underlies explicit communication and social organization. And that's like a really critical thing to understand, that what we communicate explicitly and what we choose explicitly is the tip of a much bigger iceberg.
Yeah.
That we're normally not even aware of, and we just take for granted.
And, well, this actually kind of reminds me, or I could relate this to the gender pronouns debate. Because, again, language is emergent. So the male and female pronouns, that is something that emerged. It happened, it grew out of the situation, But then when someone comes forward and says, I want to be referred to with they, them, their pronouns, or Caesar and Zai or whatever, those are like explicit constructions. Those are things we consciously do. And the reason they don't work is because there's no reason to expect an explicit construction to be emergent. I mean, maybe it could, but there's no guarantee.
And they're trying to claim the right to define language, right? And a lot of that leftist attempt to act into culture is a sort of a claim that we should socially act into culture. We should define the culture explicitly in such a way that it has certain effects or protects people or whatever, like political correctness is that in a way, right? It's an attempt to draw explicit social boundaries around culture and keep it in a box. Yeah,
and I think their thinking comes out of their own ideological persuasions, because they take something like related to like structuralism, which is basically we use things like language to help shape how we organize socially. And they think that if we can change things like language, and we can then have like a ripple effect and have that change social behavior, which will change social organization, and will break down these quote unquote oppressive social institutions.
Yeah. Well, because they view culture as the enemy, and in a way culture is a proxy for biology, right? Because in a way they view reality as the ultimate enemy. Like reality is really what they're fighting against, but they want to portray it as culture, because then they think they can fight it. Or society. They portray culture as society too. Like they see everything as like a design, right? A scheme to oppress them or something like that.
Very much. Yeah, it relates to the canonical noetic dialectic that I shared in the last discussion we had.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, and I think I might write a video about that. Just now that I'm getting out of school, I might talk about how basically their theory, I'm going to like turn it back on them and point out that their own like deconstruction of persuasion can be turned on this canonical noetic conception. Because I got this all from my legal rhetoric class, believe it or not.
Well, everything they complain about applies more to them than it does to their supposed opponents.
Because they're criticizing emergent things,
and they're trying to socially construct reality. That's the irony, right? They're calling everything else a social construct to justify socially constructing it themselves. or reconstructing it. They're social reconstructionists. But anyway, I wanted to just go back to what Vivian was saying about how her values changed because I cut her off. So,
Yeah.
sorry. And by the way, is your son asleep or did he wake up?
Yep. I just put a pacifier in his mouth and then he went back to sleep.
Ah, nice. That's a good feeling, isn't it?
Yeah. Actually, I had a different thought. And it goes back to what we were saying about morality, if morality is socially constructed or why it's socially constructed. I think that traditional morality, like traditional values, have like a biological basis. Like, I think they're there to, make things more socially cohesive and perpetuate genes. But like now the morality, it seems like the popular morality is just to make sure you're in agreement with people. Like I don't really see like a biological basis to it other than trying to get along by believing the same thing that everyone else does.
Sure.
You're right. Modern morality is very much just conformity to the current fashion, and it almost has no...
It doesn't have like any underlying basis in anything really, other than kind of turning traditional morality on its head.
Yeah, but it also doesn't really require people to do anything.
Yeah, other than affirm themselves and affirm other people.
Yeah, just don't be a bully kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're polite and you agree with people and you don't judge anyone, you're a good person.
Yeah, that is a very strange turnaround.
And I think an useful model to think this through would be Haidt's model, Jonathan Haidt's. Just I think they might tap into 2, maybe 3 moral foundations. The one which is the loyalty betrayal, so that's the in-group preference, or the you need to be loyal to the group. Then also the liberty oppression foundation, which is the desire to get back at the people you feel have wronged you, essentially. The people who are abusive with their power. So it taps into those.
But are you saying that it has changed significantly? And if it has changed, how does that square up with your idea that it's mostly biological?
Well, I remember my argument was that genetics provide the foundation, and then, well, what is it? Then the culture embellishes upon that. So it's in many ways it is like primarily just variable. It just varies within a framework, or varies upon these foundations.
Okay. All right. Well, I got another question here. Is rape socially constructed, and is consent socially constructed? The two sides of the same coin, really. Vivian, you want to go first?
I don't really think rape is rape is definitely biological, because, well, first of all, how do you define rape, and how do you define consent?
Well, that's the trick, though, because we're changing the definitions, right? So they must be socially constructed to some extent, because rape means sex without consent. That's what it has come to mean.
Explicit consent or implicit consent?
Yeah, well, that's the problem, right? It's changing,
Right.
And then what does consent mean? So, sex is biological, right? But the notion of rape to me seems like socially constructed. The act itself, the event, is not. The event is biological, but the definition of an event as rape seems to me to depend on a social construct, right? And how it meshes with the actual event.
Well, I think it's important to note that there's at least some conception of rape that exists in every culture. This is, again, another human universal. So you could point out that our definitions of what actually entails this, or what is rape, might differ, but we still all consider at least something rape. So again, I think it's one of those things where we have to just balance it, where we all have, say, a vague idea that rape is a thing, but
I wonder
go ahead.
if in other cultures, like the idea of rape is less about violating someone's individual rights and more about taking something that doesn't belong to you, even.
Yeah, like even the notion of sexual property rights used to be very different, right? Like men owned women in a sense.
Exactly.
Feminists are not lying about that was the way things worked. A man who was married to a woman had the rights to her body, and he could not rape her.
That's exactly it. And that's why it is so confusing now, because that the whole one of the reasons marriage arose to begin with, was to basically legalize the consent.
Well, yeah, it was to create rights and obligations around sex, to tie it to this social construct of marriage so that it could be socially enforced. Something like a pair bond could be socially enforced. And yeah, part of that was sexual property. When we've thrown away marriage, the original concept of it, and then we've created this whole big problem of consent. How do you define consent when it takes place between two people in private, and how are they going to socially construct how are they going to socially construct consent? Like, how can you have a socially enforceable set of conditions for sex when it's this deal between individuals that is negotiated in private, usually without even explicit communication?
This is
Yeah,
what,
I mean,
oh, sorry.
well, the problem here is that when someone rapes somebody, you need to get everyone in society to agree so that that person ends up imprisoned. So the utility of marriage was to make the idea of consent explicit and known to everyone beforehand, to establish that. And then once you make it private, as it is today, then
well, it becomes very hard to socially construct it because you're not doing it in society.
Yeah, like you can't convince the rest of society to go along with you anymore.
Yeah.
This is what people like Christina Hoff Sommers kind of miss, because they're always going on and on about, like, you weren't raped, you just regret it. But like, I feel like they're always just missing the point of like what that's like signifying to begin with.
Yeah, they just assume that everything should work out fine, and they don't see this huge problem with their worldview, which is that, or even with their just the notion of consenting adults, that it's not that simple, and it's really hard to make these kinds of judgments. Like, for society to judge whether two people consented to sex it's really hard to do. Yeah, they don't see that big flaw that this the sexual revolution, wasn't entirely a good thing. Like, they just see it as more or less an unmitigated good. And
Right.
they're just these little mopping up operations, like, oh, the feminists just went too far and we just need to, rein in these crazies. But yeah, they don't realize that, no, it really can't work.
I'm always amazed that someone would base their entire career writing books about all of that and never like address that part of it.
I have that feeling about so many people. But I think maybe it helps them to succeed, to have tunnel vision for their own vision.
I think some ideas are more appealing if they talk on a more superficial level. If you talk about like the more fundamental, like the roots of the problem, it doesn't really sit well with most people. It's just not very appealing, and it's also not necessarily intuitive, maybe.
Yeah, well, one of the ironies about the whole social construction thing of the left and of feminists is that consent is a social construct. I guess rape is also a social construct after the fact in court. That's another thing maybe I should have mentioned, because we decided in a court of law. And like the thing that they think are social constructs, like sex or gender, are mostly biological, but then they take consent, they take that for granted or assume that that's kind of obvious, it's just a trivial thing, and that is a social construct. And when they don't understand the implications of that being a social construct, that you can't just construct it between two individuals in a room by themselves. In a non-social situation, you cannot create a social construct. So they seem to like completely miss that point.
But it's entirely consistent with what we were talking about, or what you mentioned, which was just the selective application of their critiques. And, they tend to think all the things that they hold dear are natural. And then everything they disagree with is just, again, socially constructed and can be gotten rid of.
I feel like they would actually be horrified that you suggested that rape isn't socially constructed. Because I think they do picture it as like the worst thing in the world. Like, how could that be socially constructed if this tragedy happened to me? Or maybe not. I mean, I think that they would be horrified by that for some reason. Maybe just because you're doubting they would take it as a sign that you're maybe doubting that something bad happened to them, and they can't really go beyond that.
Yeah. In a way, a lot of their worldview is based on reversing things, like trying to put feelings ahead of reality, and the social construct is like comes after feelings, I guess. Like that, like the whole thing about you must believe women when they say that they have been raped. That's definitive. They are raped. Comes out of that desire to impose their feelings on the world, right? That anything that prevents them from realizing what they want must be some kind of bad thing, some kind of conspiracy, and and of course reality is the ultimate enemy, right? It really is like a war against reality.
I think that they might just also associate social constructs with things that don't matter, or things that are
things they don't like. Yeah.
Things they don't like. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that was talked about in that the social construction book that I was reading. Basically, social constructs, that seems to imply that it's something that needs to be changed or reconsidered. That's the only reason anyone would talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I have one last question. Is physics socially constructed?
Like the laws of physics, or the
let's let Lee take this one first, because I think he'll have an opinion on this one. Yeah, I guess the laws of physics, the theories of physics. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say that all of science works through constructed models of reality. Though I don't know if I would, and they are, I guess if we're going to make the distinction between something that's socially constructed and something that is emergent, it would, like a physical model of reality, that would be, or a model of physical reality, that would be more on the socially constructed side. However, what renders it distinct is the fact that we consciously make references to empirical reality. It's not something that we just dream up. It's not some abstract model that we fabricate and say is true. We test these models. We make sure that they're predictive of future data, that they're falsifiable. Basically, there's an active interaction between what we're observing in the natural world and this model that we've constructed.
So we give nature, we sort of construct the model, but then we toss it over to nature. And if nature rejects it, nature gets to bash the heck out of it, right? And if nature doesn't like it, it gets destroyed. So you could say it's selected by nature, or you could say it's constructed by us. Both are true, right? It's constructed by us, but it's selected by nature. Ideally.
Yeah. Ideally.
Yeah, there's also a lot of social pressures and stuff in science, in the actual practice of science.
Yeah. And it is up to us to make sure that it interacts with observation of the natural world, we have to choose to actually test it,
Right, and we socially choose whether to accept it, whether the testing has been sufficient, right, all that stuff.
So, yeah.
So basically, everything is a social construct. We're coming to that conclusion. I'm just kidding.
Absolutely. Well,
I have
actually,
one
let
thing
me
to
just.
add about physics. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say something that was mentioned in, again, that social construct book was that there are some social constructionists that argue that there is no determined way for physics to develop, that these models are contingent on social forces to some degree. And basically, we construct a model and then we go and find evidence to fit that model. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm as extreme as that, but that would be like an extreme version, a more relativistic perception of physics.
Vivian, what do you think? Physics, social construct, yay or nay?
Well, it's interesting because you brought up laws as something like very explicitly socially constructed, but the laws of physics were not socially constructed. They definitely just exist, like the laws of calculus exist. But technically, can't the laws of physics be suspended in a black hole?
Well, that would be a law of physics too, if they could be. I mean, the law would have to permit it, I guess. I mean, the whole idea of natural laws is a metaphor from our laws. You know, we're sort of imposing that metaphor of control, social control onto nature, and saying that nature has laws that all the little atoms and molecules must obey. Because, you know, I mean, it's an interesting metaphor, right? So even the notion of there being laws of physics instead of just a reality is kind of, it's certainly a metaphor that humans impose on reality to some extent, but it seems to work. So that's the vindication of it.
Is calculus socially constructed?
Now you're putting me on the spot. I would say actually all of mathematics, I wouldn't say socially. See, I don't like, okay, yes and no. It's to some extent culturally emergent and to some extent socially constructed. But at the same time, it works because of something about reality and something about our minds. So I guess all of these things are coming back to this interdependence between our brains, reality, and the ideas that we create to mediate our interactions with reality.
Yeah.
Right? They all have to fit together. Yeah, we created mathematics and we socially agree on the ideas of mathematics, or at least the laws of mathematics, and then anything you deduce from those laws is a theorem of mathematics.
Well, I mean, I guess I think the important distinction here is that something like money, there is no objective signifier. Is that the word?
Well, signified. There's no referent in reality.
Yeah, there's no referent.
It's self-referential. It's like a circular thing. It refers to itself.
Yeah, and then physics, science, or just mathematics in general, these things, they do have a referent. They refer to objective reality. So,
well, mathematics doesn't.
Well,
some people think it does.
Well, I think that in order for physics to work, then it is kind of true that we need to like select axioms that allow us to be predictive of create predictive models of reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, mathematics works, but I just mean that the symbols and the theorems of mathematics don't refer to anything real. Like they exist in their own space of ideas. That's kind of similar to the money or, you know, social reality space that we create with promises and laws and agreements and stuff. The space of mathematical ideas is its own thing that doesn't really refer to anything real. Like the number 2 doesn't refer to anything real.
I mean, well,
I think it does though.
Yeah, like what about like 2 apples sitting in front of you? Like that's not like 2 existing, but that's a description of something that exists.
No, but the number two itself doesn't refer to that situation. It's just a way. It's just a way you could. It's a system of ideas that you can use to represent that. It's kind of like
Yes.
saying language. The difference between like language and speech, I guess, that you can use mathematics to refer to something specific, like two apples, but mathematics itself doesn't have any reference. In the same way that language doesn't have a reference, but speech does, or communication acts do. So like the concept apple doesn't have any reference, but when I say there are two apples on the table, that utterance has reference. Refers to something in reality. Like, let's say the Pythagorean theorem, does that refer to something in the real world?
Um, Again, I think it would be like a description of a very general description of how certain things might be.
Like a piece of cheese with two pieces of, I mean, like,
Well, I'm just thinking of it like going back to like the two example. Like two apples, you could say two oranges, two this or that. So it's not like the specific things. It's just a very general, extracted description of many things.
well, I would say it's a language that we can use to describe, we can use to describe certain things and calculate things, and it has use. It has a use. Like, it has a lot of uses, actually. Anyway, sorry, Vivian, you think mathematics refers to reality. You're taking the realist position here.
I just remember this guy I knew, we were talking about Newton, and someone was saying, yeah, Newton invented calculus. And someone's like, and he was like, no, Newton discovered calculus. Like, calculus already existed, but he just discovered it. I never really knew how to feel about that, but
Well, I think that relates to like the mathematical realist position, which is that there's like this abstract world of mathematics out there, and that's the reason why these models are predictive. But I personally am not convinced by that, because we do know that completely different mathematical models that are derived from different axioms, they can describe the same phenomena. I remember seeing it was that one lecture I posted on Twitter, BG, about how gravity could be modeled with four separate mathematical models. I can't remember what each one was, but well, the problem with the mathematical realist position is that how do you explain the accuracy of all four of these models? Is there a separate mathematical essence for each of them? Or are they just rough representations of a physical or observable phenomena?
Well, I think that's more about physics, because if there are different mathematical models of the same thing, and they're all equivalent and they have the same predictive power, then I've got a woodpecker on my roof drumming on my. I think that's here, right? And it's not in any of your.
no.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm pretty sure it's my woodpecker making that noise. Anyway, I apologize on his behalf.
I don't know.
He's probably lonely. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, the different models of gravity. Well, yeah, I think this is probably a tangent that we should leave for another time, because I think we're opening up a somewhat different can of worms, which is more like epistemology in general and science, scientific knowledge in general, which is of course related, but
Yeah, and I just do want to mention that when Newton invented calculus, he was doing physics. So I don't think we can draw a distinction between mathematics and physics.
well, you can draw a distinction between them. Like, Newton invented calculus as a tool for doing physics, but calculus isn't about physics, right? Like, and you don't even have to have calculus to do physics. You could do it without calculus. You can get pretty much the same effect without calculus. And the funny thing about, let's see, this is why I didn't want to get into this, because I'm going to go off on a tangent. Anyway, never mind. We should probably wrap it up.
I have another question or thought, but It may be too much of a tangent.
No, go ahead. Well, let's just end
Like,
on a bunch of tangents so we have lots of worms wiggling on the table for next time.
well, okay, so the first thing that you mentioned that's constructed was explicitly is money. But
Mm.
if money represents value, like does intrinsic value exist, or is that constructed too? Like, because if you have like a pile of coal and a pile of not gold because that's too much like money, but like food, like that, doesn't that have sort of have intrinsic value because it's like maybe not
I mean, I think the value might be tied to desire, which
desire,
is
right?
so. Man, see, this might be the connection where it isn't purely socially constructed.
Hmm.
Well,
If you're in the desert, though, like water would have an intrinsic value, right? Because
Mm.
well, I don't think it would have an intrinsic value, but it would have value to you as, a means of keeping you alive.
how is that not intrinsic then?
Well, I just mean intrinsic in the sense that, like, it's not value unto itself. Like, water isn't valuable to water. It's just, or it's not valuable, period. It's just valuable to you in certain circumstances.
Is your life does your life have intrinsic value in the first place?
Well, I know I wouldn't say that your life has intrinsic value, but I think you need a value theory that defines some ultimate value from which other things derive value. So for water to have intrinsic value, it would have to be that in your value theory, water is like a core value.
Mhm.
And so I don't think it would be intrinsic, but I know I think what you're saying is just the value of water is going to depend on the circumstances. And well, when it comes back to money, I think you're saying something like money represents value, right? Which I don't think money does represent value. Like, you can have millions of dollars. How do I put this? The water in the desert thing is a good example, right? Like, a glass of water in the desert when you're going to die of thirst is extremely valuable, right? So you might be willing to pay $1 million for it, and you wouldn't be willing to pay $1 million for that bottle of water normally, like a bottle of ethos water at Starbucks. You might not be even willing to buy it all, because you can get free water at Starbucks. Now you can get free everything, so at least free
Always drink
washrooms
water,
after you
actually.
drink the water. But all of these things, like whether it's money or scientific theories or whatever, we ultimately use to mediate how we interact with reality. We use them as individuals or as collectives to change the way we interact with reality. So money, when you spend it, you get physical goods, right? And then those physical goods interact with your subjectivity through your experiences of pain or pleasure that you get from using the goods. And they interact with your physical body, right? With your objective reality as well.
Well, would you say that perhaps value is, or excuse me, money is a way in which we make our values more concrete or existent in reality? It's like an explicit, like a reification or something, which allows us to, I don't know, collectively recognize how value is manifest within a certain social context, I guess.
Well, this is a tangent, but I think money is a medium of exchange and it's a coordination mechanism. So it's like a way to coordinate the actions of many different people. But I don't think it represents value
Well,
because
I
like
mean,
the price of something is determined, like money interacts with our actions through prices, right? And prices are determined not necessarily by the maximum amount you're willing to pay, which would be something like the value to you, but also by the lowest cost necessary to produce something.
uh,
So
I
I don't
mean,
think. Yeah, go ahead.
wait, I wouldn't. I think that might be a little bit of an oversimplification because we do have conflicting values. Of course, we're not going to value something so much that we're going to pay. So we have to like balance our values. So how much do I want this particular thing? How much am I willing to pay for it? So you're just balancing it. But man, I was going to say something, but shoot. I just you said that it was a way of money was a way of mediating exchange, was it?
Yeah, it's a coordination mechanism. So it doesn't
Well, I would say
represent value.
Well, I would say, wouldn't that necessitate value though? Because I mean, if you want to coordinate things, like you need to acknowledge how people value it, right?
No, yeah, but see, like anytime there's a transaction, all that matters for the transaction to take place is that the person on one side of the deal values like let's say you're selling something for money. I have to value the money more than the good to buy it, and you have to value, I have to value the good more than the money to buy it, and you have to value the money more than the good to sell it, right? So you can't think of money as a representation of value. You have to think of it as just it's really just a consumption right, and it's a right to some share of the economy that is determined by this whole complex system of people's wants and abilities. And so, yeah, I don't think you can think of money as having any meaning outside of that system.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe representation isn't the best word. Maybe I need to think more about how I could articulate this idea.
That was a big worm, though. So, any last thoughts? Any other?
I think we've covered quite a bit.
This conversation could go in so many different directions, and it is very confusing to talk about.
I don't know. I think it was pretty good. I think it was kind of fun, and I think we managed to convey what I wanted to convey, that it isn't simple.
Mm-mm.
You can't just dismiss the notion of social constructs as this meaningless bibble-babble philosophizing nonsense. But at the same time, the way it's used by mostly the left, but not just the left, is fallacious and is equally naive. I wanted to dismiss both of those sides and present a view that is more complex. And I just wanted to talk about the way we use ideas, because I think that's the point. Most people never think about all the different ways we use ideas. We don't just use them to represent things. We also use them to mediate our interactions. And yeah, they are, to some extent, emergent in culture, and then they are also, to some extent, explicitly created. And then at the same time, there's also a reality that they represent that constrains them as well. Like with physics, there's a physical reality. Then if they don't fit it, or if they're not useful for predicting and explaining it, then they don't work, and we throw them away. But I just wanted to present that more complex view. So I think it was good, because I think it did bring out all that complexity.
Yeah, I definitely think we did a good job organizing these three different categories: the emergent, the constructed without reference to external reality, and then constructed with reference to external reality.
Yeah.
What are you going to title this?
That's a good question. Got any suggestions?
No.
Okay.
What the fuck are social constructs?
That's probably a good one. Well, okay, let me think about it. I mean, it could just be...
What is a social construct?
Yeah, what are social constructs?
It's not a bad...
Or social constructs and reality. Something like that, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys, well, have a good evening, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Bye.
All right,
Yeah.
bye-bye.